Welcome to another lesson on Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark, and we'll be looking at Galatians chapter 1, finishing verse 6, getting into verse 7. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them. And thy word was unto me the joy and rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we saw in the last lesson, in the first part of verse 6, he says, I marvel that you are so soon removed. You're transposing the grace of God. You're taking the grace of God out, and you're inputting the law of Moses in its place. From him that called you unto the grace of Christ, unto another gospel. And that's where we begin now. Paul said, I'm shocked. I'm shocked that you did receive the grace of God, but now you're leaving the grace of God and you're beginning to supplement the grace of God with the law of Moses. And he says that this action, this teaching that you're receiving, it sounds like a gospel. It sounds like good news, but it's not. He says, unto another gospel. And here, this Greek word for another, you have to understand that in the Greek, there are two words for another. And one of them is heteros, and the other Greek word is allos. Heteros and allos. These are two main Greek words that are used for another. All right? Now, heteros means another of a different kind. And allos means another of the same kind. Now, for example, let's say you and I go to a park and we walk around the park, all right? And in the corner of the park, there is a vendor, an ice cream vendor. And I say to you, would you like an ice cream? And you say yes. So we buy an ice cream and we walk around the park and we talk. And then we come back around the park. We finished our first ice cream and it's been a long walk. And now we're back to where we began at the vendor. And I ask you and I say, would you like an allos ice cream? Meaning, would you like another ice cream of the same kind? And you say, no, I would like a heteros ice cream. Meaning, I would like another ice cream, but I want an ice cream of a different kind. All right? And in this verse, the Greek word is heteros. He says here, you've been removed from him who called you into the grace of Christ unto an heteros gospel. A heteros, another gospel, but it's another gospel of a different kind. What the Judaizers were teaching the Galatian believers sounded like a gospel. It sounded like good news, but it was good news of a totally different kind. Okay? It was another gospel, another good news, but it was of a different kind. The Judaizers' good news came from a totally different kingdom. It was based upon the law and not upon grace. The good news in the eyes of the Judaizers was actually bad news in the eyes of God. All right? Now, be careful what you listen to on the radio, what you watch on TV. Are they teaching from a foundation that your relationship with God is based upon grace? If they do, then that's an allos gospel. It's another of the same kind. If they teach that your relationship with God is based upon, well, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to keep this liturgy, You got to keep these rules and regulations. Then that's a heteros gospel. That's a good news, but it's a good news of a different kind. But to the Christian whose heart is filled with grace, it's actually bad news. All right? So he says, I marvel you're so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel of a different kind than what I taught you. Now verse 7, which is not another. Now this Greek word for another is allos, meaning it's not another of the same kind. It's not the same gospel that I taught you. All right? The good news that the Judaizers taught through the law was not the same good news that Paul taught through grace. All right? But he says in verse 7, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. Now, this Greek word trouble here is tarasso. It's tarasso, and it means to disturb. And in this context, it refers to a mental disturbance, all right? Not a physical disturbance. And this Greek word is used also in Acts chapter 17, verse 8, where the Bible says the Jews troubled the minds of the Thessalonians people against Jason and Paul. The Bible says that the Jews troubled their minds. Okay, it was a disturbance of their mind in the Thessalonian people's hearts against Jason and Paul. And in Acts chapter 15, verse 24, Gentile believers were troubled because they were taught by certain people that they must be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. So again, it's a troubling of the mind here. So he says here, which is not another gospel of the same kind. It's not the same gospel that I taught to you, but there be some that trouble you, that are disturbing your mind. They're troubling you against the gospel of grace, and they're getting you to believe a gospel of another kind, a heteros gospel of legalism. Okay? And then he says the last part of verse 7, and would pervert the gospel of Christ. Okay? And pervert here, the Greek word is metastrepho. Metastrepho, and it means to transform something into completely the opposite character. It says they want to pervert the gospel of Christ. What is the gospel of Christ? It's the gospel of the grace of God, the gospel that God came to this earth to die for us on the cross, and that our acceptance with Him is at the cross. And these people, these Judaizers, want to come in and pervert it. They want to transform it into a gospel of legalism, where now our acceptance with God is based upon us keeping a law that no one can keep. All right? The same Greek word for pervert, metastrepho, is used in Acts chapter 2, verse 20, where it says, the sun shall be turned into darkness. The sun will be turned into darkness. And in James chapter 4, verse 9, laughter will be turned into mourning, and joy will be turned into heaviness. All right? And this is what they're doing. They're taking grace and turning into law. Grace to law, right? Laughter to mourning. Joy to heaviness. They want to pervert and turn grace into law. The Judaizers were changing the gospel of salvation by grace through faith into salvation by good works. By good works. Salvation by grace and salvation by good works are are diametrically opposed to each other. You can't have a little bit of grace and a little bit of works. It just doesn't work. You can't say, I'm going to live for God. I'm going to keep the law of Moses. Oh yeah, and a little bit of time I'm going to live by grace. You can't do it. You're either living by the law or you're living by grace. The two can never come together and work together. The very existence of the gospel of grace through Christ was at stake. And this is why Paul was so determined in his wording here in verses 6 and 7, that because what is at stake here is the gospel of grace. He wants these Galatian believers to stop stop substituting the grace of God with the law of Moses. Don't listen to these Judaizers, but continue on in the grace of Christ. Continue to have your minds and your hearts focused on the cross of Christ, on the mercy of God and the grace of God. Live your lives according to the grace of God, not based upon the law of Moses, because no one can. No one can do it. And as I said last lesson, you and I know people. We know people who have done this. They've listened to, they've given way in their hearts and in their minds to another gospel. Oh, it's a gospel. It's good news, but it's good news to those who teach it, but it's not good news to the Christian. It's actually bad news. All right? Because it's a heteros gospel. It's a gospel of another kind. It's coming from a different kingdom. But the gospel, Paul said, it's not the same gospel that I taught. It's not an allos gospel. Because if it was, they would be teaching you to come to Christ through faith. But it's a heteros gospel, another of a totally different kind. Stop listening. Don't give in to it, but continue on in your walk with God by grace, by the gospel of grace. All right? Until next lesson, walk with the Lord. I know He walks with you.